I know you're wondering how he ended up like this. I mean, how did a man with dreams as big as Legos end up alone, broke, battered, shattered, and with nothing but regret? Let me take you on a journey that will open your eyes, make you question what really matters in life, and maybe, just maybe, make you think twice about what you're willing to sacrifice for money and power. This is the story of Kola, a young man whose greed and desperation for a better life led him down a path that he could never walk back from. But let's start at the very beginning. Kola was no different than most young men in Lagos, full of dreams, full of ambition, but with no means to achieve them. The world was tough, and so was his life. His mechanic shop was small, nothing fancy, just a corner of the city where cars came in for repairs and hopes went to die. But there was one thing Kola had that no one could take away from him: Ngozi. For 7 long years, Ngozi was Kola's rock. Even when he couldn't pay the bills, when food was scarce, when his dreams felt miles away, she was there. She never complained. She believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. She worked 2 jobs to help him get by, encouraging him every step of the way. She would tell him, "Kola, one day, we'll look back at all this and laugh. You have it in you to make it. I know it." But Kola could only dream. The weight of his failures crushed him each day, and slowly, he began to believe that maybe his dreams would always be just that, dreams. Kola was stuck. His business wasn't growing, and every day felt like a battle. He couldn't even afford to put food on the table, and yet there was Ngozi, always positive, always hopeful. She was a one light in his dark, cramped mechanic shop. Then one day, things changed. He didn't know it then, but it was the moment that would set everything in motion. A sleek white vintage Mercedes-Benz pulled into his shop. Kola had never seen a car like it. So pristine, so luxurious. The door opened, and out stepped a woman who looked out of place in this part of Lagos, but in a way that intrigued him. Her name was Mrs. Margaret, 95 years old, but she had a presence that made her seem timeless. Silver hair, a gentle smile, but there was something else in her eyes: loneliness, emptiness. It was clear to Kola that this wasn't just any old woman. As he inspected her car, he noticed her driver standing nearby, looking just as out of place. Kola struck up a conversation with the driver, more out of curiosity than anything, and that conversation, seemingly ordinary at first, would change the course of his life forever. The driver spoke. She's a wealthy woman, but no family, no children. She's been alone for years. It's sad, really. A woman with so much, yet no one to share it with. Kola's ears perked up. He didn't know it yet, but those words would spark something inside him. An ambition, a desire, a dream of wealth and comfort that he had never imagined. Mrs. Margaret was lonely. Kola could see it in the way she looked at him. She wasn't just another customer. No, she was a woman who wanted something more, something she hadn't had in years: companionship. What Kola didn't know then was that the seed of his next big decision was already planted. He would do whatever it took to change his life, even if it meant sacrificing the one person who had always stood by him. He spent days thinking about it, obsessing over the possibilities. Mrs. Margaret was rich, beyond what he could ever dream of, and she was alone. What if he could make her feel special again? What if he could make her believe in love? In youth? What if he could take her away from her loneliness, and in doing so, take her wealth for himself? Kola couldn't get the thought out of his head. He knew it was risky. He knew it was selfish. But he also knew that this might be his only shot at a life of luxury. He couldn't let it slip away. And so, Kola began his plan. He started treating Mrs. Margaret differently than the other customers. He made sure to speak to her, to ask her about her life, her story, anything that would make her feel seen, valued, and important. The more he spoke to her, the more he realized how much she was drawn to him. She spoke about her late husband, about the emptiness in her heart, about the life she had lived without children. Kola didn't care about her past. He didn't care about the love she had lost. All he saw was an opportunity, and he wasn't going to let it slip. He offered her a way out of her loneliness. He told her he could make her feel young again, that he would take care of her in ways no one had ever done before. He promised her love, companionship, and excitement. Everything she had longed for in the years since her husband passed away. Kola wasn't just playing a game. No, he was setting his sights on something bigger. He wasn't just trying to win Mrs. Margaret's heart. He was trying to win her money, her life. He thought to himself, asterisk, this is my way out. This is how I'll make it. This is how I'll change everything. And so, after months of carefully crafting his words, his actions, and his promises, Mrs. Margaret, the lonely old woman who had everything but love, finally accepted Kola's proposal. And just like that, Kola's life changed. Kola didn't know it at the time, but his world was about to turn upside down. The very thing he had fought so hard for, a life of wealth, power, and status, would come at the cost of his own humanity. The one person who had loved him through thick and thin was about to be cast aside, and Kola would be the one to make that choice. The days following Kola's proposal to Mrs. Margaret were a blur. His mind raced with excitement at the thought of what was to come. For the first time in his life, he saw the door to a life of comfort and luxury wide open in front of him. All it took was convincing a lonely 95-year-old woman to believe that he was the man she had been waiting for all her life. And he had done that so effortlessly, Kola felt like he was walking on air. For months, he played the role of the perfect suitor. He had promised her the world, that he would cherish her, protect her, make her feel young again. But behind the smooth talk and the sweet words, his true motive was simple: money. He was playing a dangerous game, and with every moment that passed, he grew bolder, more confident in his deception. But there was one thing Kola had forgotten, one thing that would come back to haunt him. Ngozi, the woman who had loved him through the darkest times, the one who had stood by him when no one else did, was still in the picture. Kola knew what he had to do. The only way to truly seize this opportunity with Mrs. Margaret was to rid himself of the one thing that tied him to his old, struggling life. Ngozi, the woman he had shared 7 years of his life with. The woman who had stayed with him even when he couldn't give her the things she deserved. But now, he had a chance to do more. He had a chance to escape from the life that had held him captive for so long. And if that meant cutting ties with Ngozi, then so be it. The evening he decided to break up with Ngozi was a cold one. It was as if the universe itself had known that a storm was about to break. Kola sat in their tiny apartment, staring at the dimly lit ceiling. The weight of what he was about to do was almost too much to bear. But the allure of Mrs. Margaret's wealth pulled at him like a magnet. How could he pass up this chance? Ngozi walked in from the kitchen, her apron still tied around her waist. She smiled as she approached, not knowing that her whole world was about to shatter. He had been acting strange for days, distant, almost detached. But she didn't know that tonight. The man she thought she would spend her life with would break her heart in the cruelest way possible. Kola looked at her, his expression hardening. His words were cold, calculated. Ngozi, I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine. You're the reason I'm still stuck here. The reason I can't move forward. I'm done. The words stung like a slap across her face. Ngozi froze, the air between them thick with tension. She shook her head, as if trying to make sense of what Kola had just said. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice trembling. We've been together for 7 years, Kola. 7 years. I've stood by you through everything. Through the bad times, the hard times. How can you just throw it all away? Kola didn't feel the weight of her words. He had already made his decision. The future he had dreamed of was right there in front of him, waiting to be claimed. I'm tired, Ngozi. Tired of living like this. I'm marrying someone else. Someone who can give me what you never could. His voice was cold, almost heartless. I'm done with you. I'm done with this life. I'm moving on. Ngozi stood there, stunned. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had loved him. She had given him everything she had, her time, her energy, her love. And this was how he repaid her. Kola, no. Please don't do this. She cried, her voice breaking as the tears began to fall. I love you. I've always loved you. You can't just throw me away like this. Kola didn't respond. He turned his back to her, unable to look at the woman who had given him everything, the woman who had stood by him when no one else would. And just like that, the decision was made. Kola walked out the door, leaving behind the woman who had once been the center of his world, the woman who would never be the same again. In the days that followed, Ngozi was a shell of herself. She couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. She cried for days, for weeks even. The pain was unbearable. She had given him everything, and he had discarded her like she was nothing. Kola, on the other hand, was already moving on. His heart was cold, focused only on the future that awaited him. Mrs. Margaret had already accepted his proposal, and soon he would be living the life he had always dreamed of, a life of wealth, luxury, and power. But as Kola began to bask in his newfound riches, something began to gnaw at him. Something was missing. He was getting everything he wanted, but the emptiness he felt inside only grew stronger, and that emptiness would soon consume him. The life he had always dreamed of was finally within his grasp. Private jets, 5-star hotels, lavish shopping sprees in Paris and London. Kola was living a life that most people could only dream of. He was driving expensive cars, wearing the finest clothes, staying in penthouses that looked out over the entire city. He had it all, but none of it felt real. None of it felt as satisfying as he had imagined. Kola started to realize something that he had failed to acknowledge all along: the price of his success. Kola thought he had it all: the money, the cars, the freedom. The world was at his feet. He had escaped the shackles of poverty, and now he could live a life of unimaginable luxury. But even as he reveled in his newfound wealth, there was something he didn't see coming. There was something about Mrs. Margaret's generosity that he had missed. Something that would soon change everything he thought he knew about success, love, and betrayal. Let me take you deeper into Kola's fall from grace, and how the very thing he craved most, the money, would be the very thing that destroyed him. Kola's life had been transformed. Gone were the days of struggling in a tiny mechanic shop, fixing broken-down cars for a few thousand naira. Now, he was living in luxury, something he had only ever dreamed about. But the taste of wealth, as sweet as it was, couldn't fill the void in his heart. Mrs. Margaret's wealth was his new reality, but it didn't bring him peace. It brought him an emptiness that he hadn't expected. The first few months after his marriage to Mrs. Margaret felt like a dream come true. Kola was living a life of excess, flying private jets, staying in 5-star hotels, shopping for designer clothes, driving the finest cars. He felt untouchable, invincible. But deep down, there was a gnawing sense of discomfort. He had everything, but somehow it didn't feel like enough. Kola spent his days enjoying his newfound wealth, but his nights were different. At night, when the lights went out and the silence settled in, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Mrs. Margaret was kind. Yes, she doted on him, treated him like a king, but she was also old, frail, and lonely. Kola began to realize that the wealth he had gained was tied to her age and her inevitable decline. The clock was ticking, and every day, the woman who had given him everything grew weaker. One day, Mrs. Margaret fell ill. It was a sudden thing. She had been complaining of fatigue for days, but Kola had brushed it off. He told himself she was just old, that it was natural for her to slow down. But when she collapsed in the middle of a dinner party, everything changed. Kola panicked. He called the doctor, who immediately suggested that she be flown to America for specialized treatment. But deep down, Kola knew the truth. Mrs. Margaret was dying, and with her death would come the end of the life he had built. His wealth, his power, his status. It was all tied to her. If she passed away, he would be left with nothing. Kola didn't show it outwardly, to the outside world. He was the doting husband, the successful businessman, the man living the dream. But behind closed doors, he was preparing himself for what he believed would be the ultimate reward: her death, followed by her fortune. He started to count the days. In his mind, every moment she spent in the hospital was one step closer to her passing. He had already begun fantasizing about the properties, the cars, the money, everything she had promised him. He would be the heir to it all. But the more he thought about it, the more hollow it seemed. What would he do with all the wealth if he was alone? Would it really fill the emptiness he felt? Kola couldn't answer that question. All he knew was that Mrs. Margaret's illness meant the end of his struggle, the end of his need to work, to fight for his future. It was all about to be handed to him on a silver platter. When Mrs. Margaret was flown to America, Kola's mind raced with excitement. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He was going to be free. He would inherit everything. The mansion, the cars, the businesses, everything. But even as he stood on the edge of his success, something inside him shifted. His excitement was tainted by fear. What if she didn't die? What if she recovered? Deep down, Kola knew he wasn't prepared for a life without her wealth. He wasn't prepared to return to the life of struggle he had known before. Months passed, and Mrs. Margaret's health worsened. Kola received updates from the hospital, but he didn't need to hear them to know the truth. Her time was running out. And then, one day, he received a call. The one he had been waiting for. The one he had prepared himself for, asterisk. Mrs. Margaret had passed away. Kola's heart raced. Ahan! He had done it. His dreams were about to come true, and now he would finally be able to live the life he had always wanted, without any more sacrifices, without any more hard work. But there was something Kola didn't expect, something he couldn't have prepared for. 2 weeks after Mrs. Margaret's death, a letter arrived. Kola's hands shook like the way leaves shook on a dry harmattan morning. He opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. It was from the U.S. Embassy. The letter informed him that he was to stay away from all of Mrs. Margaret's assets. She had left her entire fortune to charity. Kai! Kola's heart sank. His world began to crumble. All the hopes, the dreams, the luxuries he had been counting on, they were gone. Mrs. Margaret had willed everything to charity. His mind raced in disbelief. How could she do this to him? Didn't she love him? Didn't she see how much he had given her in return? How could she betray him like this? Like a drowning man, Kola fought back. He tried to argue with the lawyers, claiming that he was her husband, that he was entitled to everything she had. But it was no use. The law was clear. Mrs. Margaret had made her decision long before she passed. She had known exactly what she was doing. The more Kola fought, the more he lost. He was locked out of the mansion he had once called home. He was forced to return the cars, the money, the luxury. He had nothing. Nothing but the bitter taste of regret. Kola had reached the pinnacle of his dreams, only to watch it all crumble into nothingness. The riches, the lifestyle, the woman. It was all slipping through his fingers. What started as a chance of a lifetime had turned into his greatest nightmare. And now, he was left to deal with the consequences of his actions, questioning whether any of it had been worth it. It didn't take long for Kola to feel the weight of his loss. In the blink of an eye, everything he had once called his was gone. The mansion, the cars, the private jets, they were all stripped away. The life he had spent months, even years, dreaming of was nothing more than a distant memory now. He sat on the cold, hard bench in a police cell, his hands trembling with the frustration of his failed attempts to hold on to what wasn't his. He had fought to keep the wealth Mrs. Margaret had left behind, claiming his rights as her husband, but his pleas had fallen on deaf ears. Kola had never imagined it would come to this. He had been so sure that he could win, that he could somehow prove that he deserved what he had taken. But he was wrong. The law had spoken, and there was nothing he could do. He had been forced to surrender everything. The hardest blow, however, came not from the loss of material things. It came from the realization that his actions had destroyed more than his financial future. They had destroyed the only person who had ever truly loved him, Ngozi. The woman he had abandoned for a life of wealth and comfort was now gone from his life. And Kola knew it was his fault. He had traded her loyalty, her love, her companionship for a future that now seemed like a cruel joke. Kola sat alone in his cell, staring at the cold, gray walls. He could feel the loneliness creeping back in. He thought about Ngozi, about how she had stood by him through thick and thin. She had believed in him when no one else did. But now, she was gone, and Kola was left with nothing but regret. He thought about the last time he had seen her, the look of devastation in her eyes when he had walked away from her. He could still hear her cries, still see her face as he had broken her heart. He had been so focused on his own desires, his own dreams, that he hadn't realized how much he had hurt her. And now, he had no way of fixing it. Days passed, and the realization of his mistakes began to eat away at him. Kola knew that he couldn't go on like this. He couldn't live in regret, wallowing in self-pity. He had to make things right, at least in the one way he could. So, with what little dignity he had left, Kola made the decision to find Ngozi. He knew it wouldn't be easy. She had every right to hate him, to never speak to him again. But Kola had nothing left to lose. He had hit rock bottom, and if there was any chance of redemption, he had to take it. Kola's journey to find Ngozi was not easy. It took him weeks to track her down. He had heard rumors about her, that she had moved on, that she was married to a wealthy man now. But Kola couldn't shake the hope that maybe, just maybe, she would listen to him. Maybe she would forgive him. When he finally found her, he was shocked. She was living in a beautiful home now, far from the humble apartment they had once shared. She had a husband, a child, a family. The sight of her happy life made Kola's heart ache. Was it too late? Was it really too late for him to fix what he had broken? Tears welled up in Ngozi's eyes as she listened to Kola's apology. She had cried for weeks after he left her. She had questioned her worth, her ability to love. But now, standing before him, seeing the broken man who had once been the love of her life, she knew that forgiveness was the only way forward. "Kola," she whispered, her voice full of pain and sorrow. "It hurts, you know. It hurts to see you like this. To know that you've lost everything, just as I did. But I've learned to forgive, not for you, but for myself. I can't carry this anger forever." Kola's heart soared. She had forgiven him, but her forgiveness came with a price. She asked him to prove himself, to show that he was truly sorry. And in the end, Kola's path forward wouldn't be easy. He wasn't entitled to anything anymore, not even her forgiveness. He would have to start from the bottom, just like he had years ago. Ngozi's husband, seeing Kola's sincerity, offered him a job at his factory. It wasn't much, but it was a chance to rebuild his life, to earn back the trust he had lost. Kola accepted without hesitation. As he stood in the factory, working alongside men who barely made a fraction of the money he had once spent in a day, he understood the value of hard work. He understood that wealth wasn't just about money. It was about integrity, loyalty, and love. Kola had lost everything, but in the process, he had gained something far more valuable. The lesson that greed could take away everything that truly mattered. And now, as he worked to rebuild his life, he knew that the road to redemption wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long time, he was willing to walk it. Kola's journey teaches us that wealth and success, when pursued through deceit and greed, come with a heavy price. True treasure lies not in material possessions, but in the relationships we nurture and the integrity we hold. It is never too late to turn things around, to seek forgiveness, and to rebuild what has been broken. What is the greatest lesson you've learned from Kola's story? How has greed impacted your life or the lives of those around you? Type a sentence of affirmation in the comments below that reflects the life lessons from this story. Let's share our thoughts and grow together. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories.